Now there is one last hook, not in general, there are more hooks, but there is one last hook which I want to dive in right now because it fits really well into this section here, into this module. For that, we'll first of all have to change our code a little bit though. We'll create a new component, an input component, that contains our input divs and that receives all the data it needs through props. So that, just like the button, it's reusable, because we will indeed reuse it for the email and the password input. Now, feel free to try to create such an input component on your own and use it here in this login form. That's a little mini assignment, a little mini task you can dive in. Here's a short pause for you to pause the video, and thereafter we'll do that together, and thereafter we'll see which hook I'm talking about. So, were you successful? Let's do it together. For that, in the UI folder, I'll add an input folder with an input.js file, and in there from React, I import React because we're going to create a component in there. The input component which gets props and which we export here, just like this. Now, the JSX that should be returned here, as I mentioned, should be that div here. So I'll grab that div from the email, cut it from the login component, and add it here as a return value. And therefore, I'll also add an input.module.css file to bring over all the styles I want. So I'll import classes from ./input.module.css, and of course also migrate the respective styles. Here in the login module, I'm basically talking about all those control styles here. They are all related except for the actions. So actually I'll cut everything in front of actions because actions is part of the login component. Bring the control part into the input module CSS file though, and that of course then also includes this media query. Bring that over as well. And with that we got the styles migrated. Now back in the input component, we now got some data we need to get from outside. To make this reusable, I of course don't want to focus on just the email state here. Instead, I'm just interested in whether this input is valid or not. So I expect to get just a isValid prop on my props object here to then add this invalid class or not. This text here should be settable from outside, let's say on a label prop. This ID here should be settable from outside. So I will expect this on an ID prop. This type here should be settable from outside. The value should be settable from outside. And here the change and the blur handlers as well. So here I'll have on change, and here I'll have on blur. And this should be a quite reusable input component. And we can now use this here in the login component where we previously had that div. So there, I'll add the input component. Of course, for that, make sure you do import it. You do import your input component here from the newly created input file. And now we need to configure that component. So for example, we need to pass our ID, email, our label, which was email like this, our type, which is email, and also the isValid prop, which is the email is valid constant, which we essentially have up here, pulling it out from the email state. That's something we want to forward. And of course, we also need the value prop that needs to be set on our email state value, and also on change and on blur. So on change here is our email change handler, and on blur is our validate email handler. And with that, we have our email input. Now we also, of course, need to migrate the password. So here we're going to replace this div with this input, but now for password, the label text should be password, the password, the type should be password. Here we have password is valid. We have the password state value. We got the password change handler, and we got the validate password handler here. So with that, we should have the same behavior as before, and we do, that works. But now we have these separate components here. Now that's a nice practice, and that's always good. And it's also a good example for when we want to use props versus context. We absolutely want props here because those input components, as you can see, should be reusable. And therefore we use props so that we can configure them from inside the parent where we are using them. If we would use context inside of the input, every input would do the same thing. It would be bound to the same context. It might be less reusable then. But that wasn't the main focus. This instead just now allows me to move on to the next hook, which I want to show you.